Who is your hero? We relish stories about heroes. History's full of stories of men and women who willingly gave the ultimate sacrifice, their lives for the sake of someone else. It might have been a mother or father who gave their life for their child or for their children. It might be the story of a brave public servant, a policeman, a fireman, or an EMT that gave their life to save someone that was in desperate trouble and whose life was in danger. It might be the story of the soldier that sacrificed himself or herself to save their comrades. Or it could be the story of a captured soldier or spy that suffered unimaginable torture, followed by death to save a nation from tyranny. Now, we call these people heroes, and rightly so. Today I want to continue to share the story of the greatest of all heroes, who suffered torture and death so that untold millions might be spared from the worst of all deaths, death in hell for eternity. So please join me now as we continue this amazing story. We pick up our study today after 3 attempts Pilate has made to release Jesus. But the response of the crowd is still to cry out for his crucifixion, even though Pilate has found him to be innocent. As we read John 19 and verse 6, we find that Pilate makes another attempt, his 4th attempt, to set Jesus free. In verse 6, John writes, "Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' Pilate said to them, 'You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him.'" Now, Pilate makes the 4th declaration of Jesus' innocence, and he refuses to pronounce a Roman sentence against him. Now, you see, from the perspective of that time, by Roman law, Pilate has the final human decision concerning Jesus' execution. Jesus will not be executed unless Pilate says so. And at this point, he refuses to pass the Roman sentence. Now, in John 19 and verse 7, we find how the Jews respond to this. The Jews answered him and they said, "We have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." You see, the charge of sedition did not work. So they drop it now and they go back to the issue that's been troubling them all along. The issue of Jesus' claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, John chapter 19, verses 8 through 11, tells us how Pilate responded to this. "Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. And he went again into the praetorium, and he said to Jesus, 'Where are you from?' But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and the power to release you?' Jesus answered, 'You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin.'" Now, in the first stage of the trial, Pilate had learned that Jesus was the king of a kingdom that is not of this world and is not to be established at this time. And Pilate has also received a warning from his wife, who suffered greatly in a dream because of Jesus. Now, hearing that Jesus claims to be the Son of God, he was even more afraid. So what does he do? Well, he tries to have another interview with Jesus, but Jesus would not answer his questions. Well, why wouldn't Jesus answer him? Well, you see, Pilate had received sufficient light to respond in a positive way, but he responded to Jesus with a sarcastic, "What is truth?" So now no further light will be given to him. Pilate presses him to answer because he has the authority to release him or to crucify him. Then Jesus reminds him that all governmental authority is only delegated from above. And by the way, probably a good thing for us to remember right now, too. He only has delegated authority and not final authority. Furthermore, the ones who turn Jesus over to him will be guilty of the greater sin. Now, let's go back to the gospel account in John 19 and verse 12. And in verse 12 it says, "From then on Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, 'If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar.'" Now, Pilate tries for the fifth time to release Jesus, but what happens? Well, it fails. And it fails when the crowd cries out, "If you release this man, you are no longer a friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Now, folks, it's really important to understand Pilate's response to this accusation. Look at chapter 19 of John again, and verse 13 and 14. "When Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out, and he sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, at about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, 'Behold your king.'" Now, what is the significance of Pilate sitting on the judgment seat? Well, from the judgment seat, a verdict must be issued. And if the verdict is guilty, a sentence must be issued and carried out. Pilate has come to the point of making a decision. Now, Pilate would not normally care what these Jews were calling out. So the question here is, why would he be intimidated and afraid by this particular outcry? "You are no friend of Caesar's if you allow this man to live." Well, Arnold Fruchtenbaum shares that there were at that time events going on in Rome that caused Pilate to be in quite a difficult situation. You see, Pilate had a friend named Sejanus. Sejanus was the captain of the Praetorian Guard, which was a very influential position in Rome. And when he became captain of the Praetorian Guard, Sejanus got Pilate the position of procurator of Judea and Samaria. But later, Sejanus decided that he would prefer to be emperor, not just captain of the guard. So he organized a conspiracy against the emperor of that day, who was Tiberius. But the conspiracy was uncovered before it could be carried out, and Sejanus and his co-conspirators were all executed. Now, at the time of Jesus' trial, the Senate was investigating everybody who had anything to do with Sejanus to see if they were part of the conspiracy. And so Pilate himself was under investigation. And the last thing he needed was for word to get back to Rome that he had released a man claiming to be a king and therefore a competitor to Caesar. Now that explains why that outcry from the Jews was sufficient to put him on the judgment seat to make his decision. But even from the judgment seat, Pilate makes his sixth and final attempt to have Jesus released. He brings him out and declares, "Behold your king." At this point, John interrupts his narrative to observe that it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. Now, folks, this is so important and so critical for our understanding. See, John reminds us that the official Passover offering is being prepared to be offered in the temple. Pilate now takes his place on the judgment seat, which is on the outside of the praetorium. Now, you'll remember that when they led Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate, the chief priests themselves did not enter into the praetorium. You remember why they wouldn't go in? Well, they didn't want to become unclean because they wanted to eat the Passover later that day. And what was the word Passover referring to in that context? Well, not the day, but the offering. It referred to the Passover lamb itself, the lamb that was to be killed at the third hour in the temple and later eaten by the chief priest and the 24 chief priests. Now, the word again refers to this same Passover lamb. Now, do you realize why John mentions this? Because at the very time when Jesus was being sentenced by Pilate, the Passover lamb was being prepared in the temple. And as to the hour of that preparation, it was about the 6th hour. So what's John's point? Well, of course, it's that Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, is also being prepared for the once for all sacrifice which is about to occur. Now, this was Pilate's final attempt to release Jesus. He brings Jesus out and he declares, "Behold your king." So how do the Jews respond to this? Well, in John 19:15 it says, "But they cried out, 'Away with him, away with him, crucify him.' And Pilate said to them, 'Shall I crucify your king?' The chief priest answered, 'We have no king but Caesar.' We have no king but Caesar." They denied Jesus as their king, and they own Caesar as their king. Pilate's not going to make any further attempt to have Jesus released. Matthew chapter 27, verses 24 through 25 continue the narrative, or give us another perspective on this narrative. And he says, "When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water, and he washed his hands before the multitude, saying, 'I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it.' And all the people answered and said," now folks, this is just blood curdling. They cried out and they said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Instead of releasing Jesus, what does Pilate do? Well, he calls for a pitcher of water and he washes his hands, assuming that merely washing his hand exempts him from any guilt. Well, folks, it didn't. You see, the final decision whether Jesus lived or died was his, and only his, to make. He knew what the right decision should have been, but he made the wrong decision because of what they were saying. And merely washing his hands didn't absolve him from his guilt. It was up to him to make the final decision from the human perspective. Now, the early church did not absolve him of his guilt. For example, when Peter preaches his message in Acts chapter 3, he names several men guilty of the death of Jesus, and Pontius Pilate is among those he names. Another example comes from the earliest church creed called the Apostles' Creed. And one of the sentences in the Apostles' Creed says, "He suffered under Pontius Pilate." Now, we also know that God did not exempt him. From history, and history records that in the year 36, he was finally deposed as procurator, and he was banished to Gaul. Now, Gaul is the area that we know as Vienna, Austria today. He was sent away by Caligula, and he later committed suicide and paid for his role in the trial of Jesus. His action of washing his hands is a fifth declaration of innocence. And of the 5 declarations of innocence, this is the most significant because it was made from the judgment seat. Now, how did the Jews respond? Well, they said, "Remember, his blood shall be on us and on our children." You know, it's really interesting that only Matthew mentions this response. And the reason is that Matthew's the one who traces the consequences of the unpardonable sin. Remember when the Jews accused or attributed the miracles of Jesus to Satan and said he was in league with Satan and rejected Jesus as their Messiah? And it's Matthew who records the consequences. And it's also important to notice that the curse of the blood is limited to them and to their children. It doesn't go any further than that. There's no mention of the third and fourth generations. Now, in the year 70 AD, it finally fell upon them and their children when Jerusalem was destroyed and they were killed. Now read Luke verses 23, chapter 23, verses 24 and 25 with me. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested, and he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison. But he delivered Jesus to their will. And then John 19, verse 16 also records, then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took him away and led him away. Now Pilate issues the death sentence against Jesus. And who does he release? He releases Barabbas. Remember who Barabbas is? And from our last study, his name was Yeshua, and Barabbas was a title. So Yeshua Barabbas was who they released. So, and literally it's Jesus, the Son of God, is who they released. But it's important, this was a very symbolic substitution. You see, the innocent Jesus, Son of God, will die in the place of the imposter, the guilty one, Jesus Barabbas, or Barabbas, the criminal. And folks, then Pilate turns Jesus over to be crucified. Jesus has been tortured, and now he will be taken and executed. He willingly gave himself to save untold millions from eternal death in hell. We need to not only acknowledge this heroic act, but we need to accept what he did in our behalf, because that's the only way we can have eternal life in heaven with him. Next time, we will closely examine the procession to Calvary. There's so much more for us to learn in this passage. Until next time, shalom.